Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 14. 1 week to go, so we're really getting close. Hope you guys are starting to think about your final papers and starting to write your final papers because it's coming up soon. If you have any questions or concerns about that, let me know. Also, not this week, but the next week will be the final quiz as well. So you have 2 assignments left. You have the final quiz, which will be online on Canvas. Similar to the other quizzes we've taken, you can use your notes, my videos, things like that. And then after that, the final paper, and that's it. So as far as assignments go. Okay, yeah, so if you guys have any questions about assignments or anything, let me know. So this week we're looking at civil rights, right? And obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover everything that we need to talk about regarding the civil rights movement in the United States. There could be an entire class, and there are classes taught on the civil rights movement. There are classes taught, obviously, on feminism as well. But just as all the other topics we've been sort of going into in this course, we're just going to hit some of the high points. And also, what I'm actually more concerned about, than the movements themselves, which are interesting from a sociological perspective and a political perspective, but I'm more interested in the broader political theory, American political theory question behind these movements, which was the question that I sort of posed to you guys in last week's discussion question about where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie with, are we expecting government to give us these rights, or in a regime of self-governance, which we supposedly have and are set up to have, is it incumbent upon ourselves to actually make these things happen? And if we are making them happen, how are we doing that with the cooperation of government, right? Because obviously the answer to my question was, not either or, but and both, right? You have to take the action and government has to take the action as well. So how do we have that kind of collaboration? Okay, another important thing, and this is true for all of the other topics we've talked about, and this, it's bringing in the historical context of, when these movements are taking place, what else is happening in American society that's sort of shaping these events, right? So, and it goes back to that. I think I started off in the very beginning talking about how American history is essentially characterized by, this movement towards, greater civil rights, more inclusive civil rights, given out to different aspects of the population who, although we're not included in that original, cast of, aristocratic white males, we're taking that language that existed in the Declaration of Independence and existed in the Constitution and trying to expand it to include, all men, right, and women, right, men as in mankind. So okay. Anyway, enough rambling, enough preamble from me. Civil rights. So, last week we were talking about the Cold War, but we have to take several steps back to really get into sort of the civil rights movement, right? Because, let's go back to Civil War, right? Civil War ends, the Union wins, and shortly thereafter we have the passage of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th Amendment gave equal citizenship rights to African American males, and 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to African American males, right? Because once again, women were still not allowed to vote at this time, so we're only talking about African American males, right? But also during this time, you have to remember that we're going through the period of Reconstruction, right? And still, the majority of African Americans reside where? They reside in the South. So all the things that are happening, these things that are revolutionary things that are trying to be implemented, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, are being implemented in a place that is devastated by the Civil War, right? Where racial prejudices, are deeply ingrained in the blood, and this whole Reconstruction process is trying to happen. So trying to put those amendments into place and those rights into place is kind of like trying to plant a seed on concrete, right? The social environment was just not well equipped to move in that direction towards more inclusive rights for African Americans. So that's when the Jim Crow laws started to happen, right? Where, even though there was sort of equal citizenship, we sort of get into this concept of separate but equal, right? Where there are these laws about, we go to different schools, you're not allowed to use this particular bathroom, you're not allowed to mix with whites in restaurants, things like that. So even though African Americans, on paper constitutionally, have these equal citizenship rights, it's not playing out in reality. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court even upheld, this sort of separate but equal Jim Crow laws. So that's what's going on. It's developing. World War I breaks out. World War II breaks out. Lots of African Americans serve in World War II, right? Some people call World War II the springboard for the American Civil Rights Movement. Because in order to undertake social change and to be, civically and politically engaged, you have to have certain skills, right? So you have to be able to organize groups. You have to be able to work in teams. You need leadership. You have to be able to communicate. Well, what's a great environment for teaching, how to be in a team, right? Leadership, the military, right? The military prides itself on those things. So all these African Americans go into the military to serve in World War II. They're over there serving their country. They're defeating evil, and there, racial prejudices are not as, speaking as someone who was in the military, they're not as apparent. They're not as big of a deal, in a lot of ways in the military, because the guy on your left, whether he's black or white, could save your life or is responsible for saving your life. So a lot of that stuff sort of gets pushed aside, at least for the time being. So African Americans are used to serving in the military. They're used to being treated with respect. They get these leadership skills, these teamwork skills. They've seen the world, right? So they're not just, haven't been in their sort of own, little area. They've been to Europe, Asia, things like that. So they come home and they're like, come home, a war hero, treated like crap in some cases. African American veterans were beaten. One guy was blinded. Terrible things happened, right? So, they've experienced this equality in World War II. They've developed these skills. They've seen the world. So that's when a mass migration actually started happening, right? A lot of African Americans after World War II started migrating north and west. And that's when this notion of we had these rights, while we're in the military, we don't have them anymore. Therefore, we need to start working to get those equal rights at home, right? So that sort of was a springboard, and then shortly after that, NAACP, Brown versus Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall was the head attorney during the Brown versus Board of Education, which essentially desegregated the schools. So this happens, but even still, with all this legislation, it's starting to gradually happen, right? Still, African Americans are not being treated well, as we saw in King's letter from a Birmingham jail, right, where he was talking about the way that African Americans were treated, right? So we're in the Cold War. Vietnam breaks out. Vietnam breaks out. Once again, African Americans are being sent to Vietnam to fight for their country, right, where they have, supposedly an equally vested interest. And this was also the first time in any military conflict where white and black soldiers were integrated. They weren't serving, in different units. So this caused a lot of controversy as well, right? It was, a lot of African Americans at home, were saying, why should our, African American sons and daughters be fighting this unjust war, especially for a country that treats us like crap, right? So it keeps fomenting dissent in that way. We have the Cold War, right? The Cold War is going on like we saw last week. We have this age of sort of big brother government, McCarthyism, surveillance, the military-industrial complex. It seems very oppressive, right? So that's why we have the baby boomer generation coming along and sort of taking this radical turn towards sort of like individualism, right? Trying to escape from sort of these larger political and social forces of government intrusion. So we have all these things going on, right? This great mix, and then we have a leader that steps forward, Martin Luther King Jr., who really starts to organize and pull this movement together, right? So and then of course this was the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. If you guys haven't seen the movie, I would highly recommend it. It's great. And the things happen that that we've all heard about, right? It's the Civil Rights Act. So it was successful, right? I guess. I mean, we look today and we see the things that are going on with police brutality, things like that, and it seems like a lot of these problems are still with us. So it's a constant struggle, and I think somebody pointed out, I can't remember who it was in the discussion, about how a lot of these advantages may be available for some, but for for the poor, the uneducated, things like that, they still are in pretty dire straits. So that's a very quick spin on the civil rights movement. There's a great iTunes University series on the civil rights movement. If you want to learn more about it, it's called Civil Rights: Voices of a Movement, and I think it has 10 or 12 different lectures. That starts all the way going back to Jim Crow, all the way up to where we are today, and goes into obviously much greater detail than I just discussed, but definitely worth a listen. So the other angle we were looking at, and there are tons of angles for civil rights. I mean, it's we often think about the African American civil rights movement, but there are tons of groups that fall into the civil rights movement. Hispanic Americans recently, gay Americans now, right, is obviously a big thing. But the other major strand we looked at, in this particular last week's paper, was feminism and women's rights. And we had Du Bois, who actually, she's still alive. She's a professor at UCLA, a history professor, and all of her work is primarily in the history of women's rights in America. So if you want to know how she feels about what's going on now or where women's rights are now, you can find her. You can find her online. And she writes pretty often for the Atlantic magazine, the New Yorker, several different publications. So she's still around, still out there. So she was talking about first wave and second wave feminism, and of course now we have third wave feminism, sort of a crude and sort of shorthand way of putting it, and I'm by no means an expert in feminism, but first wave feminism was primarily concerned with women's suffrage, right, getting women the right to vote, making sure that women had the same equal citizenship rights that were granted to African Americans in the 14th Amendment. Second wave feminism got more towards the social norms, the things that I think, at least for my generation, we typically associate with feminism, 60s, 70s, job equality, workplace equality, reproductive rights, birth control, right, sexuality, all of these social norms that, traditionally were sort of like considered taboo for women. You're supposed to be a housewife and monogamous and not in touch with your sexuality and certainly no birth control, right, all these things. Second wave feminism was sort of the school of thought or the school of feminism that dealt with a lot of those social issues. Now we have third wave feminism, which third wave feminism kind of made the argument that second wave feminism was primarily concerned with white middle class women, right? Heterosexual women. So third class feminism goes even farther and looks at non-white, non-heterosexual women, the women who are not within that sort of power class of, let's say, white middle class heterosexual women, right? The disadvantaged. So third wave feminism is more concerned with that, economic advantages, power dynamics in society. So yeah, and of course, they're making the same argument, right? I mean, both Dubois and King in the readings that we had last week, they're saying, you can't trust the people that are in power, the oppressors as they call them, or the males. You can't trust them to treat you equally. Yeah, you can go in, you can fight in World War II, you can go into the factories and produce weapons for the soldiers who are going into World War II, and you're doing this great stuff. But when, the rubber meets the road and everybody comes home, you're still a second-class citizen, right? And they're saying, look, you can't expect the first-class citizens to give you the same rights, to give you the rights that they have, right? If you're really interested in doing that, you have to take it, right? And that's essentially, what I was getting at with my question about, JFK's inaugural address and his famous quote, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, right? Which is kind of a perplexing statement in a way. There are lots of different ways to sort of break that down, right? One way to think about it is your country, right? And is it your country, first of all, right? I mean, it should be, right? If the power, resides with the people, if we live in a sort of a system of self-governance, it should be your country, but is it really? Certainly not for women and African Americans, right? So is it even your country? If you're from one of these, disadvantaged groups, and then ask what you can do for your country, right? So, how can I take action, right? So it's not, we can't, rely on, Congress, the president, the Supreme Court, all the political institutions that are in place to meet our needs, right? That's not the way that self-governance works. That's not the way that our society works, at least if we want it to work, towards the things that we deem to be important, right? You hear people all the time, it's any restaurant you go into, any TV show you watch, anytime you're talking with somebody about politics, it's, well, government sucks, President Obama is a socialist and Congress can't get anything passed, and all that, right? But that's sort of abdicating responsibility for the system of government that we purport to have and the system of government that we champion around the world, right? And that's what King and that's what Dubois and that's what all great political leaders would tell you, right? And JFK, right? I mean, that's what he's saying, is that you have been given this amazing privilege of living in a system where self-governance is the guiding principle. So don't complain if you decide not to be active in your system of governance, that things aren't going the way that you want them to, right? You have to take, if you want those rights, if you want those privileges, I mean, all the way back to the American Revolution, right? Same story. Power dynamic between the British and the colonists, right? If we wanted our rights, we declared them, we had to take them. Same thing with African Americans, right? Same thing with women. Same thing we're going to see with homosexuals, right? With gay marriage, and sex equality. It's ironic, you hear some of the laws and things that are going around now in Indiana, some other places about, whether, businesses should have the right to deny service to homosexuals or homosexual couples, or, not, treating them differently in the workplace. it's like the same story that you heard, with African Americans or women, right? You just replace African American or woman with homosexual, put it in there, and essentially you have the same arguments being made on the side of the people who are in power, right? In this case, the heterosexuals. So, yeah, sorry for the rant, but the bottom line is you have to take that action, right? If you want to live and prosper in a system that champions self-governance, you have to be willing to take place in the governance, and it's not enough to simply be a spectator. We can't be a spectator and expect equal rights. Expect democracy to work. Now, that's not to say that there's not another side to that coin, right? Because, sure, it's okay to petition for these things, right? But ultimately somebody has to institutionalize these rights and these liberties, and that's the role of government. That's what the role that government is supposed to play, right? They're the ones that are supposed to put the institutions in place to make the laws that represent, what the people want, whether it's, equal rights for African Americans, whether it's equal rights for women. The legislation should make laws to enforce that. Should make the laws. The executive branch enforces it, right? And then in the cases that could be sort of in the gray area, the Supreme Court and the judiciary interprets those laws, right? So the government does have a very important role to play. But when we abdicate giving those institutions the substance of what we think that our society needs or where we need to be going, and we're letting those institutions and those politicians make those decisions, then it shouldn't be surprising that we're not happy with what we get, right? Because you have to remember that politicians are making decisions based on political calculations. They're not making the decisions that oftentimes that even reflect public opinion, right? I mean, there have been several studies that said that most policymakers don't rely on public opinion polls. They don't take a public opinion poll before they make a particular policy decision, unless it's in an election year, right? So you have to make your opinion known, and you have to be involved in the process. So anyway, that's where I was going with that. That question, it takes both sides, but at the end of the day, we, the people, need to drive the bus. So anyway, that's it for this week. If you guys have any questions about final paper or the quiz, let me know. This week we're looking at, I call it contemporary American thought, which is a little crazy because we're going all the way from Reagan to Obama to the Tea Party now, which there's a lot to sort of pack in there. But, we'll do the best we can looking at that, going from sort of Reaganism, trickle-down economics, government is bad, to sort of to Obama and the Tea Party. So anyway, I hope you guys have a good week. If you have any questions, let me know.